In 1998, I had become obsessed with germs. I was convinced that invisible disease-causing bacteria and viruses lurked around every corner, were smeared floor to ceiling in every public bathroom, and lay in wait on every coffee table. Seemingly overnight, I began hounding my family members to wash their hands, gagged at the thought of a 5-second rule, and lathered myself in Bath & Body Works Sweet Pea hand sanitizer until my skin cracked.
Not the Sweet Pea.
Not the Sweet Pea, yeah. And this obsession, in turn, made me obsessed with science, with understanding the tiny world around me. And then, once I found out the likely cause of this germophobia I'd developed, my obsession only grew. Welcome to episode 100 of Tiny Matters. Yeah.
Da, 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 da.
Oh my gosh. Deboki, how are you feeling?
The first word that came to mind was old. I don't know why 100 episodes of a podcast should make me feel old. We're not that much older than when we started.
Yeah. I mean, it has been almost exactly 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I feel wiser and yet not different,
yes.
But also tired. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you have a baby.
Yeah, I have a new baby. Okay, yeah, that's probably why. It's probably not the 100
This is the old
episodes.
baby. This is our 4-year-old.
Yes.
That is now a little more self-sustaining, can kind of run itself, do its own thing.
Yeah, we have a system down for our 4-year-old podcast.
Yeah. You can tell that neither of us have 4-year-olds yet because we're 4-year-olds, they can just do things, right?
Yeah. If someone is listening and has a 4-year-old, they're like, oh, just wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. So welcome to episode 100. Today we are talking about what got us obsessed with science. I think, there were I had mulled over a few different things because I think it was a number of experiences, right? I was a kid that grew up. I mean, my dad, now retired, was a science teacher. Mm-hmm. He got me really interested in the natural world starting when I was very, very young. So I think, that got me on the science bandwagon early.
Yeah.
But this experience that I'm going to delve into today is really what kind of set my obsession with science afire. So there you go.
I'm excited. I mean, this sounds like it's going to be quite a ride, but I'm really excited to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you'll be very intrigued, interested. I think it also is one of those things that explains my interest, but also my personality and a lot of other things. So we're going to hit all of it. So
sounds great.
I'm going to hop into that. And then Deboki, you are going to share what got you interested in science after that. So this is a little bit different of an episode, right? This is not a fully scripted episode like a lot of our episodes, but we've got this is going to be, I'm biased, but this is going to be a good one. Yeah. All right, let's do it. So let's go back, starting in 1998. So much to my and my family's dismay, I really struggled with pretty debilitating germophobia for years. Mm-hmm. It was and so I should also give the context of in 1998, I was 8 going on 9 years old. Mm-hmm. And so I was feeling like I was no longer in my own body or my own brain. I was seeking constant validation that everything I touched or every person I walked past wouldn't make me super sick. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, with a mix of time and therapy and very understanding parents who were both educators, I reached a much healthier headspace by my early teens. But I would say I was and still am more germ aware than your average person. I'm not on the verge of a panic attack when I touch a doorknob and can't immediately wash my hands, but it was really hard.
Yeah.
What I didn't know at the time is that I had developed obsessive compulsive disorder. I think there was not, I don't know, just speaking for myself as a member of the general public, it felt like there wasn't as much of an understanding of what obsessive compulsive disorder could look like.
Right.
I was not someone who was turning off and on a light switch a million times, washing their hands 75 times until I was overdoing it with a hand sanitizer, I alluded to, but I wasn't it wasn't physical. It wasn't manifesting physically most of the time. And so people didn't really know. It would be I was highly functional, But internally, I was doing this thing called mental review, which a lot of people with OCD experience, which is like you become fixated on something and you go over it and over it and over it in your mind. And like you seek validation to make sure that like nothing bad is going to happen or, you know, whatever it may be. Like you cannot let it go. Like it's very, very hard. And I think a lot of people are like, just let it go. And it's like, no, like my brain was not wired to do that.
Can I ask, like, would this be something like if you saw something, like you were saying, like the idea of the 5-second rule? I guess what I'm asking is like, do you have an example of like what that looked like? Like what would cause it and what that looked like then in your head?
Right. So like, let's say there's like a seat and I sat down on it. And then when I stood up, I realized that there was like some gum, maybe like on the side of it. Yeah. And I didn't think that I had touched the gum, but I wasn't totally sure. And in my mind, then I would think, did I touch the gum? Well, okay, I don't think so, but am I sure? Do I know that I didn't touch the gum? And if I did touch the gum, what could happen to me? Like, how could I get sick from this? What, like, could I get sick from it? Like, how long does gum have to stay on a chair for it to no longer have bacteria or viruses in it? Like, how dirty is gum? Who is the person chewing the gum? Like, I could, like, as you can tell, like, I could go off a cliff thinking about this kind of thing. And my parents were very understanding, but it was like, what is going, like, you know? Yeah. So when I was doing some research for this episode, I came across this really interesting quote from a book from 1833. And it's from a doctor talking about this thing called choleraphobia, which was the idea that this was during, like, cholera, I mean, was big for centuries and still is an issue in certain places. But there was this idea, I don't think it was very widespread, but it was this idea that you could actually get cholera or like die from fear of getting cholera. And so the quote is, "To calm the imagination is a thing in general impossible. The patient is persuaded of the truth of his delusions, and the nervous system being in such a disordered state, he is no longer master of himself." Yeah. And I was like, that was my experience. Right. Do I think obsessing about cholera will give you cholera? No. But, you know, it was kind of like, this is, again, 1833. They're trying to figure out what's going on with some people who are just so terrified of getting cholera. Right. Some people were then actually like dying, but it's like they could have, I don't know, it's 1833 now. Yeah. Like the list of things you could die of it was long. Yeah. But yeah, I thought that was a fascinating quote. And I'm like, okay. So this whole like situation of being like a generally like, was I a kid who was like a little more anxious, a little more cautious, like all these things? Yeah, I was like the eldest daughter, like standard, you know, but this was a weird and very sudden shift in like my personality, essentially. And even though a lot of it, no one would have really known except for my family members, who I felt like I could then seek validation from and ask all these questions and talk about my concerns and worries, I was still really struggling. And it got better and better, but like it was always in the back of my mind, you know, like even when I was in high school, it was in the back of my mind, and it wasn't as intense. And like my, you know, friends in high school, like wouldn't have known at the time because I wasn't going to share this like part of myself, but also like I felt like I had that part of myself under control pretty well. Yeah. But then one day, my freshman year of college, my dad called me to tell me about a story that he'd read in the paper, likely the Boston Globe, because I'm from the Boston area, about something called PANDAS, like PANDAS, which stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Streptococcal Infections. It begins with a simple strep bacteria infection. Like I think a lot of kids get strep at some point. Like, so it seems pretty benign, right? But these bacteria, they're pretty sneaky. Like they can hide from your immune system by mimicking healthy cells, including ones in your brain. And so then once your immune system starts to fight off the bacteria, it could mistakenly send antibodies to those healthy cells, which can cause swelling in parts of your brain, specifically a part called the basal ganglia, which is really important for motor control and decision-making and emotional behaviors. And so a hallmark for kids with PANDAS is they have a strep infection, and then they have this sudden behavioral shift, including the onset of OCD. And it can manifest in a number of ways. And a very common one is germophobia. So like the OCD is surrounding like, am I being exposed to germs? Did I, you know, will I get sick? All that. And so like my dad is like telling me this, and he's kind of in disbelief. And I'm kind of in disbelief because between ages 8 and 10, I had strep throat over a dozen times.
Oh my God.
And like, I had this thought of like, I wasn't crazy. Like my brain was swollen. Like, or, you know, it just like this wild realization.
Yeah. Just like a lot of puzzle pieces probably coming together at once.
Yeah. And so the first publication of a collection of cases of PANDAS actually came out in 1998, but it wasn't super broadly like discussed. And it was kind of like, it wasn't something that people were really talking about. And there was also a lot of pushback. Like, this seems too ridiculous. Like, are you kidding me? A virus is going to cause swelling in the brain.
Right.
Now, look at COVID. Look at, you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, like there are going to be potential psychiatric effects when you have a viral infection. So yeah, like it's really over the last decade that physicians and the broader scientific community have begun taking it more seriously. And it's only in the last couple of years that some states have started requiring medical coverage for kids with PANDAS.
Do you know how they first started putting the pieces together that like kids were experiencing this?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I don't remember off the top of my head how it was put together, but I remember the doctors who were kind of at the forefront were seeing these patients and then trying to kind of understand what have you experienced recently? Like what are the different like have you been sick? Have you been this? Have you been that? And like I think then sort of like the evidence started to sort of pile up and they were seeing this correlation, right? And then from there they were able to it's hard to say if it's causal a lot of times, because also, you know, a parent could for years and years and years be like, what's going on? And then you realize like, you don't have a strep infection anymore, right? Like, and I didn't have a strep infection anymore, but I was still like had these tendencies. And I think anything with the brain is just like really hard to navigate.
Right. And I imagine one of the ways that it's easy to be dismissive too, it's like if a kid like, you know, like someone like you who had strep throat like multiple times, like became germophobic, it would feel like, well, maybe that's just why. Like maybe it's just like she's been sick.
Right.
Doesn't want to get sick again. Understandable.
Right.
Like it would be easy to be dismissive about like a more like physiological connection between the two.
Yes, absolutely. So, and I think like, again, I was very high functioning in terms of like, because this was not interrupting my life in terms of, you know, hey, I need to like, you know, wash my hands 700 times a day. And I need to count, you know, how many times I touch that doorknob. And I need to, you know, like it wasn't that. And so I think like, it was sort of like, well, she's doing well in school and she has friends and she plays sports and she's fine. And it was like, yeah, like in the grand scheme of things, I was fine, but like mentally I was not always fine. And it was very hard to navigate as a little kid too. And also my parents are so great about it and understanding, but like, it's confusing. Like it's very confusing. So this whole experience, like starting, like even well before I learned I likely had PANDAS, like it sparked a fascination with germs. And then even more so, like a fascination with like, how do viruses or, you know, bacteria cause these neurological symptoms and, you know, like have an influence well beyond like the sort of like traditional understanding of how it might work. Right. And so like we've talked about germ theory in past episodes, but I thought it would be kind of interesting just to talk a little bit about it again, because like that's ultimately where I went with it was like, and of course, the first science class I ever took in college was an elective that I took as a freshman, my fall semester, literally called Disease and Pestilence. So, yeah, I was already on that track, but then just like learning this about myself was like, all right, I'm diving even deeper. Okay, so in 1676, Dutch microbiologist Anton van Leeuwenhoek, which I'm saying poorly.
No, that's close enough.
So he peered through the lens of his microscope into a tiny world. He called what he saw moving around animalcules, or little animals. But what he didn't know at the time was that they weren't animals. They were likely bacteria. And then in the following centuries, scientists and physicians continued to look through microscopes, often, you know, mistaking what they were seeing for minuscule worms or insects, but also then starting to hypothesize like these could cause disease. In 1844, that's when you have Hungarian-born obstetrician Ignaz Semmelweis. And he was the one that saw that in a Vienna hospital where he worked, when physicians and medical students delivered babies, the mothers had a much higher chance of mortality than when midwives delivered the babies. It was about a 15% risk of death versus 2%. Like, I don't know about you, but like a 15% risk of death, like, not great. So then Semmelweis hypothesized that the difference was due to hand washing. So like doctors and medical students, they were often in a morgue doing autopsies, handling corpses, and then they wouldn't wash their hands before performing a delivery, which now I'm like, oh my, like what?
Yeah, it makes you like understand like how much our understanding of the world has shaped just like what feels normal. Because the idea of like working in a morgue and then not washing your hands feels outrageous to me without even thinking about the bacteria. Like it just feels like, of course you would wash your hands.
Yeah, like you're touching dead bodies. What are you doing? Yeah, totally. So then Semmelweis, he believed that death particles, like quote, death particles from tissues of the deceased were being transferred from the hands of physicians and medical students. And like, yeah,
not wrong entirely.
Yeah. But a lot of the physicians were mad. Like they were upset with this conclusion that he'd come up with because like essentially he was saying like you are inadvertently killing your patients. And that's the opposite of what a doctor is here to do. Right. But once he instituted a mandatory hand washing policy for medical students and physicians, mortality rates leveled out. And so like on the outside, that might seem like, okay, well, that must have been a total game changer. Like everyone's on board. Everyone's on board with this. But given that miasma theory, so this idea that like the air was what was actually going to be transferring things that could kill you, and not just the air, it's like a little more complicated and specific than that. But essentially it's like decaying organic matter and like gases from the earth and like that's how you're getting diseases. That was still like reigning supreme in terms of theories versus germ theory. Again, this is 1840s. And the hospital, I guess, had just gotten a new ventilation system. So everyone's like, no, we don't really believe in this whole hand washing business. It's just that the air is cleaner. So I guess like he returned to Hungary, continued to practice medicine, published a book on these theories. They were largely disregarded. He was ultimately, it's really depressing, he was placed in an insane asylum, was the name for it at the time. He died shortly after at 47. In my mind, I was like, he's 80. No, he was 47. Man. But today he's known as the savior of mothers. And the Budapest Medical School where he once taught is now the Semmelweis University of Medicine. I will also give a little asterisk. Like, I think he had some problematic traits. And I also read in some places that he didn't always follow his own advice, which is questionable. But I do appreciate that he started to sort of like help shift the tide a bit. But really, it was in the 1870s that German bacteriologist Robert Koch first established that microorganisms could cause specific diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. And then in addition to Koch, you have French chemist Louis Pasteur and British surgeon Joseph Lister, who are credited with pretty massive discoveries that contributed to germ theory, debunking spontaneous generation, the idea that like you could get germs that like arise from nowhere. And they also, invented life-saving antiseptic surgical techniques, specifically Lister did. And then from there, once germ theory was accepted, there was this like social and institutional changes that really swept across Europe and other parts of the world. I think a lot of the information that you can find relates to Europe at that time. There were a lot of great things about that other than just people not dying from as much. Essentially, like in some cultures, the idea that, people who succumb to an infection, like certain infections, like that would sometimes be tied to being morally corrupt and things like that, which just ridiculous, or having it be some sort of curse. Right. There was more of an understanding now of like, no, it could be germs. You have these hygiene museums and fairs that are springing up to help educate the public. There are governments that are instituting new policies. In 1875, Britain's government passed a new Public Health Act that would require local governments to provide clean water, improve sewers, have waste removal, and also appoint medical officers to evaluate health facilities, which is like great. And people, I guess, were more willing to, for the most part, pay taxes to fund these changes. There were a lot of other social changes that I found really interesting. So things that used to be really common behaviors in families, like bed sharing, or even this is kind of sad, but there was this literal hands-off approach to reduce the transfer of germs. So people would be like, I'm not touching my baby sometimes, which is that's actually bad. But that was short-lived. But people used to do a lot of spitting in public, and now it's you cannot spit in public, or even facial hair became unacceptable. And in some cases it was banned. Mustaches in particular came under fire, which I thought was fascinating. In the previous century, people actually saw them as filters for dust and bad air, but now they are apparently breeding grounds for germs. And so there was this really funny, weird experiment that I came across in 1907 that showed that the lips of a woman kissed by a mustached man were polluted with tuberculosis and diphtheria bacteria, as well as food particles and a hair from a spider's leg, which is what? I don't know.
Not just a spider's leg, a hair from a spider's leg.
It seems could they have misidentified that? I don't know. But there are spiders everywhere, so who knows?
So many questions about this experiment.
Yeah, same. It was questionable. So there are all these specific regulations that come in, health system overhauls. This is great. I won't dive into it too much because there's so much that I could say. But in 1910, the first antibiotic called arsphenamine, also known as salvarsan or compound 606, became available. And it was the first effective treatment for syphilis, as well as relapsing fever. And this disease called sleeping sickness, which is caused by microscopic parasites. And in 1928, the discovery of penicillin really turned the tide forever. That kicked off decades of antibiotic discoveries that have saved millions, probably billions of lives. So now scientists can provide advice as well as medical interventions to reduce risk of illness. And governments were enforcing new rules. But what I found really interesting, and this kind of circles back to my germophobia, was that around this time, around germ theory gaining popularity, there was a word that came up assigned to a fear of germs, and it was called mesophobia.
Oh.
So it sort of separated people who were had a rational fear of germs from ones who did not. And it did lead to stigma and sometimes a literal separation from society, being institutionalized. So the term mesophobia, which I will note is not the same thing as misophonia, which has to do with sounds, that people talk about. Mesophobia now really it's the same thing as people just say germophobia now for the most part. But it was coined by a military physician in 1883. And he wrote about a patient who is an excessive hand washer in his book, A Treatise on Insanity in Its Medical Relations. And so, he said that the patient had no problem admitting, quote, the absurdity of her ideas. And then he continued saying, but, quote, nevertheless, she could not avoid acting as she did, for as soon as she was exposed to any possible source of contamination, the ideas returned in full force. And it's yep, been there. And so, then he put forth the term for this woman's condition, which would be mesophobia. And that comes from the Greek word musos, meaning uncleanness, and phobos, meaning fear. And so then, within a decade, germophobia becomes interchangeable with mesophobia. Both are still used today to describe a pathological fear of germs, uncleanliness, contamination, and infection. And that pathological fear can be reinforced through obsessive compulsive behaviors, or OCD. OCD, often called the doubting disease. It's marked by sort of this inability to let go of a worry or concern. And in this case, germs. There were cases of mesophobia reported at the turn of the 20th century. They ranged from more mild OCD behaviors to these extreme outbursts. As someone who is fascinated by science, by disease, by germs, by science history, this was just the culmination of, my personal experience and all of those things. And so, I kind of will just leave it there. But that this is a big part of my obsession with science. And it started a long time ago. And I think it's only obviously grown since then. But yeah. And I will say it took until my 30s to be formally clinically diagnosed with OCD because again, I was very high functioning and it wasn't anything that I was physically doing, but it was all internalized. And I will say that was a relief to have that diagnosis. It was really, it felt good to be I'm not failing at controlling my thoughts. I really this is something that I need help with.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was fascinating insight into the history of germ theory. And also thank you for sharing your story. That was also, I mean, I didn't really know about PANDAS at all, I think, until you were telling me about it a while ago. And I was like, oh, that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's still not people don't know about it overall, but I think because overall it doesn't affect that much of the population, but it's like any disease or condition that has a smaller impact in terms of how many people in the public it actually affects. You don't hear about it as much, but it's intense. And I was kind of on the less intense scale of it. Some kids really become overnight, they all of a sudden have a lot of behavioral issues and are very intense. And sometimes there's a violent element to it too. It's really intense. But it's an important thing for people to learn about.
Right.
Well, yeah. So Deboki, I would love to now hear about what got you into science. Where did your love or obsession for science begin?
I mean, it's so hard for me to say, kind of like you were saying too. I grew up in a science family. My parents are both scientists. My grandparents are scientists. I don't know how to completely figure out the origins beyond I just thought science was what everyone did growing up. But when you came to me with this idea for this episode, the thing that I thought about is the fact that my dad, for a while, he worked in the pharmaceutical industry. And in particular, he worked on vaccines. And so as a kid, I was kind of obsessed with vaccines. I thought, and I still do, that they're the coolest thing.
They are.
Yeah. And particularly, I just remember in elementary school, particularly 4th and 5th grade, I was particularly fascinated by the polio vaccine, which was developed by Jonas Salk. It was this huge, incredible achievement, but there were two distinct things that I remember learning about the polio vaccine from my parents, actually, because I think I was doing a report on Jonas Salk or something. There's a family story about my grandfather having met him when my grandfather was visiting labs in the US or something. It was just some of this thing that was sort of in my periphery. And I remember my dad telling me, one, that there was this really tragic incident with the Salk vaccine where there were contaminated vaccines that actually caused polio, and that ultimately led to a lot of us getting the oral polio vaccine, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then the second thing I remember him telling me, and this was him telling me again, when I was in 4th or 5th grade, so this was in the 90s, he was telling me that there was a possibility that people were going to move back to getting an injected vaccine for polio, not taking the oral vaccine. And those two things have stuck with me, but I didn't really know much about either of them. They were just things that stuck with me in terms of oh, there are these two different polio vaccines. There was this horrible thing that happened with one of them, so we got the other, but maybe we're going to go back to the other one. There's something interesting and messy there that I didn't fully understand. And so I figured today was my day to figure out what my dad was talking about and to learn about it and to see where that story has gone.
Yeah. I mean, I want to know.
Excellent. Cool. So I'm going to start with polio. Polio, it's a virus. It infects cells in the throat and the intestine, and people usually get polio through food or water that's contaminated with fecal matter from someone who's been infected. And in a lot of cases, people will end up asymptomatic. They're not going to really get sick. But in some cases, people might get flu-like symptoms. And then in 1 in 200 cases, the virus will actually start to invade cells in the central nervous system. And that leads to paralysis, which I think one of the most famous examples of this is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had polio and needed a wheelchair to get around because of the effects of the virus.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the thing that stuck with me as a kid, when I learned about polio, I learned about like the iron lung.
Yep.
And also like all the little kids who would experience some form of paralysis.
Yeah.
And was just terrifying. Like absolutely terrifying. Like, so grateful for a vaccine, but continue.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing. Like, polio has been around for millennia. It was first described clinically in 1789. But like you're saying, like these epidemics, they would kill a lot of people. Like, even if a lot of people ended up asymptomatic, there was an outbreak in New York City in 1916 that killed 2,000 people. And, you know, people who survived, they might end up needing crutches or wheelchairs or breathing devices, like you were mentioning, the iron lung. Like, I remember like watching like a PBS documentary on it as a kid. This was like my like light nighttime watching as a child about polio, where you would just like hear like these newsreels talking about polio and just like see these clips of like kids going to the swimming pool, but like overlaid on it is like a story about an epidemic breaking out. And it was just so inconceivable to me as a kid in the 90s to like think like, oh, like, of course I would just go to the swimming pool. Like, I'm not going to risk getting paralyzed from a virus from the swimming pool. But there was a time where that wasn't the case. And so in 1949, scientists at the Boston Children's Hospital were able to cultivate the virus in human tissue, which was important, set the stage for people to do more discoveries. And in the 1950s, Jonas Salk developed the first polio vaccine. He actually tested it on himself and his family in 1953. I just thought that was crazy. But I also understand it.
I mean, I guess that's, I am not endorsing that behavior, but I think he must have been pretty sure that this was the thing that was going to work if he was doing that.
Yeah. His vaccine used a polio virus that's inactivated with formaldehyde and then injected into the body like a typical shot. This vaccine is sometimes called like the Salk vaccine. It also might be called IPV. So that's inactivated polio vaccine. That's one of the type of vaccines we're going to talk about. And the vaccine was tested after a trial that involved 1.8 million children. It was officially declared safe and effective on April 12th, 1955.
That's pretty fast.
Yeah, super fast, right? Like 1953 to 1955, like especially like we talk about the COVID vaccine getting developed so quickly, but you know, this was like decades before that and using very different technology. Like COVID vaccines were able to use technology that like part of the point is to be able to move quickly.
Yeah. That had existed for, you know, a decade and was like, designed to be fast.
Yeah. And one of the things I found interesting in my research is that it was really important to Salk that there was equitable access to the vaccine. So he was asked in an interview who owned the patent for it. And he replied, well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
Yeah, I did know that. And I have a lot of respect for him doing that because it meant that the vaccine was accessible to pretty much everyone.
Right. And that's it's important both like on an individual human level for like people having access to the vaccine. And it's also important for the success of the vaccine.
Yeah.
Like even if you just like on a cynical level don't care about people and you just care about yourself, I think you should still want equitable access to the vaccine because part of what's going to make the vaccine successful for you is that everybody has access to it.
Right. Yeah, that's how you get herd immunity is by everyone getting vaccinated.
Right.
And that's how you really stay safe.
Yeah. So 5 pharmaceutical companies were given the license to produce the vaccine pretty much like right away. Like I think it was basically April 12th, it was declared safe and effective. And I think I read it was just like 2 hours or something later. And these companies had license to start making it. Super exciting. But 2 weeks later, there was some really terrible things that became apparent. 5 children in California were paralyzed after getting the vaccine. And there were 2 things that people realized looking at these cases. The paralysis was happening in the arm that had gotten the vaccine, and the vaccines that caused it were all made by a company called Cutter Laboratories. The vaccines were immediately recalled, and at that point, the Epidemic Intelligence Service of the Communicable Diseases Center looked into what happened, and they found that some of the batches that the Cutter Labs had made had live polio virus in it.
Like they hadn't been inactivated.
Yeah, so apparently this was the result of cell debris in the vaccine that was keeping the virus particles from getting exposed to enough formaldehyde to actually fully inactivate it.
So it was essentially like that debris was sort of hiding the virus, or the virus was sort of like hiding in that debris, not to like personify a virus, but like, yeah.
I mean, it was, at the very least, it was being kept from the formaldehyde that we needed to get to it.
Yeah.
So ultimately, out of the 380,000 kids who received the Cutter Labs vaccine, 40,000 got polio, 51 were permanently paralyzed, and 5 died.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I did not know this.
Yeah. And it doesn't end there, because obviously these kids have had polio. They also are spreading polio. And so this contributed to an epidemic where people surrounding those kids and their family and their communities were affected. So 113 people were paralyzed and 5 died who hadn't gotten the vaccine.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
There's a really great piece in Stat News that was published recently called "The Infamous Cutter Vaccine Changed My Family Forever, but We Still Support Vaccination." And in it, the author talks about how their cousins contracted mild cases of polio from the vaccine, but their mom, so the author's aunt, actually caught it from them and nearly died. She was able to live to 70, but she was severely affected by the infection. It's a really excellent article. I would definitely recommend checking it out.
Mm-hmm. We'll link to it.
Cutter Labs is the one that gets the most attention, I guess, for these contaminated batches. But Wyeth Laboratories also produced one lot of the vaccine that led to paralysis and death. And these cases led to changes in federal requirements for vaccine manufacturer.
Right. I want to point this out because I feel like this is a theme in a lot of the episodes. Because this happened, it's incredibly tragic and horrible, but it's one of the reasons that now vaccines are so much safer, because when these tragedies, although you wish they never happened to begin with, when they happen, just like with the methylmercury accident that, we talked about in an episode with the chemist at Dartmouth who died, the field has completely changed since then. Yeah, and it's
absolutely.
The fact that people recognize that this is unacceptable and it's a horrible tragedy and there needs to be a big overhaul just means that what we have available now is infinitely safer is how it feels.
Absolutely. And so to that point, between 1955 and 1962, 400 million doses of the Salk vaccine were given in the U.S., and they had a tremendous effect. By 1957, cases annually dropped from 58,000 to 56,000. And then by 1961, there were only 161 cases of polio.
That is wild.
Yeah.
That is an effective vaccine. That is a unbelievably effective vaccine.
Yep. However, there were still people who were affected by the Cutter Labs vaccine. And so there was a lawsuit against them.
Yeah.
This lawsuit in particular was titled Gottsdenker versus Cutter Laboratories. And the jury found that Cutter Labs weren't negligent in their process, but they were still held liable for the vaccine. And this ultimately became an issue downstream because it basically made it easier for people to sue over issues with vaccines, even in cases where studies gave conflicting information about whether or not there was actually something there, really.
Yeah.
And so that led to companies raising the cost of vaccines or just not making them altogether, which is also not great. We need vaccines. So in the U.S., this ultimately led to the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program in 1986, which is funded by a federal tax on each vaccination dose. It provides fast and easy compensation for anyone who is harmed to vaccines, but it also protects the companies who make the vaccines. So I think that's, again, to your point, I think that's an important thing. We need to balance the fact that, yes, these vaccines can have harms. And in today's world, these cases are much more rare, but we do still need to acknowledge them. But we also need to create a world where companies can be incentivized to make vaccines.
Yeah.
And from what I've read, it sounds like in dealing with the legitimate issues that have come up with vaccines, this program has also been strained by the ongoing misinformation around the safety of vaccine ingredients, and particularly the false narrative that links them to autism.
Yeah.
So that's also really unfortunate that this program that I think is probably really useful for maintaining a world where we can have the necessary recourse for people who have had issues with vaccines. This program is also being compromised by a lot of really bad and dangerous information about vaccines.
Yeah. I will say, I just had my daughter, who's 4 months, get her second round, I think, of the polio vaccine. And I felt so relieved, with her getting it.
Yeah. And it's great that you said that. I don't know if you remember what vaccine you got, but our kids, they probably got an actual shot. Like they got something injected into them for their polio virus.
Yeah.
We might not have. I can't remember. I forgot. I was going to call my parents and ask, and then was like, if I ask my dad, this is going to be a long story.
Yeah, I think, oh my gosh, that's such a dad thing. Typical dad. But yeah, no, I don't know about when we were babies, but I definitely got a shot because I got a polio booster because I was heading to Bali, I think it was like 7 years ago, and there had been a bit of an outbreak on one of the islands. And so it was suggested that I get a booster. So, I mean, like I would have never thought about it, right? Yeah. But that was definitely a shot. But I don't know what we would have gotten in like the, 89 or
Well, most likely we got the oral polio vaccine. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. So this was developed by Albert Sabin shortly after the Salk vaccine. This is called the oral polio vaccine, or OPV. It uses a version of the virus that's been weakened, so it's not inactivated. And it's been a huge success in helping to reduce polio. The viruses are weakened by growing them in cells that are different from the ones that they would be growing in if they were infecting us. So I just think that's really neat.
Yeah.
And because the Salk vaccine was working so well, the U.S. didn't originally give the oral vaccine much of a chance to like study. Like they weren't really looking at it much. But other countries were, including the Soviet Union. They did all of these tests. They saw that it was safe and effective. And one of the things that makes the oral vaccine so great is that it's easy to give to kids. Yeah. It's not a shot. It's an oral thing. And you can actually just put it on a lump of sugar and give it to kids. This is apparently the inspiration for the song Just a Spoonful of Sugar from Mary Poppins.
Helps the medicine go down. There you go.
Yeah. Did not know that. So the WHO eventually endorsed the oral polio vaccine, and the U.S. did end up switching over to it in 1963. And again, incredibly effective. And by 1979, the U.S. had eliminated polio, and the effort like worldwide has like gone on since then. In 1988, the World Health Assembly passed a resolution to eradicate polio. And by 2003, polio was endemic to only 6 countries. But again, I remember my dad telling me that like there was going to be this movement back to having a shot, like an actual shot, not an oral vaccine. And when I was a kid, this felt like secret insider information to me. I remember writing like in some kind of school thing, they're like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I was like, I want to make a good polio vaccine. And my teachers are like, there is already one. It's like, nuh-uh-uh. My dad said that there's going to need to be a different one. But I didn't know what I was talking about, really. So I wanted to understand why. And for important context, since we were kids, the U.S. made the switch back to the inactivated polio vaccine in 2000. So we had a good stretch of almost 40 years of using the Sabin vaccine. Why did we go back?
Yeah.
It's really interesting scientifically, but it's also something that is hard to grapple with. Because the oral polio vaccine is incredible, it's safe, and it's effective, but it has this one major challenge. Because it has the weakened virus in it, on rare occasions, that weakened virus can actually mutate back and become paralytic again.
Right.
So you need really good vaccine coverage in a community. So one of the things that's interesting is that actually because people are, they have this weakened virus in them, they're shedding that weakened virus, and that's getting into the community. In some cases, that can actually help with vaccine coverage because it can actually kind of help immunize other people. But there are cases where the virus might mutate back into something that's paralyzing, something that's pathogenic and not great. It's rare, but it has happened. I didn't get good stats on like exactly how rare it is. One of my sources said there were about 6 to 8 cases in the 80s and 90s, though it didn't say if that was US or worldwide. Even if it's just the US, I feel like that does kind of emphasize that it's pretty rare.
Very, but also it's like if you have an option that's going to give you 0, why would you not do that?
Exactly. And so people have improved on the vaccines as well, but also in places like the US, there was a modified version of the Salk vaccine that was introduced in the 90s. But like in some places, it's easier to switch back to that. In other places, because of the availability and the reliability of the oral polio vaccine, that's what people have continued using. It's just a big infrastructure thing to switch what you're doing, especially for something like the polio vaccine, like that is like so worldwide. So particularly in developing countries, the oral vaccine is the one that's more likely to be given. And there is additional complexity on this as well. So there are actually 3 strains of polio. There's PV1, PV2, and PV3. And the annoying thing is if you get vaccinated for one, you're not like suddenly immune to the other ones. You have to get vaccinated for all 3 to have the immunity to all of them. So PV2 was eradicated worldwide in 2015, but because people were getting the oral vaccine, they might be shedding the weakened PV2 virus. So there's that slim chance, again, that there will be that reactivated PV2 virus then circulating in the community. So the WHO advocated for the standard oral vaccine to have only PV1 and PV3, which was done in 2016. But then you still have that PV2 virus circulating. So we're in this bind where some kids haven't been immunized against PV2, but we don't necessarily want to be adding it back to the oral vaccine. So like all of that stuff gets really muddied and confusing for like exactly how to address. So scientists are working on understanding how the virus gets its virulence back, and they're figuring out like the specific genetic changes that make that possible and how to prevent those changes from happening. So I think like there's a lot of work that people have been doing to make the oral vaccine even better. And I'm sure like we're going to get even better ones in the future.
Wow.
So first of all, my teachers were wrong. There is still a lot to do with the polio vaccine. Like, there's plenty to improve.
Deboki's like going to announce that she's leaving Tiny Matters to create the next polio vaccine.
Exactly. This is actually my retirement speech. But yeah, I think overall, I just thought this was like such a fascinating story about how complex just dealing with polio has been, and like how there are all these trade-offs to the choices we make.
Yeah.
Like we did this trade-off of moving away from the Salk vaccine and moving to the oral vaccine because of concerns about how the Salk vaccine was made. And then at the same time, maybe we made some trade-offs with safety there. And also, to me, this is really about the complicated journey science takes when we're dealing with all this misinformation. And like, we really want to hunker down into this idea that science is always right.
Yeah.
And really the point is not about whether or not science is right. It's about figuring out the things that we need to understand better.
Yeah.
And like having a world that's like conducive to being honest about the things that are good and are bad about like a particular thing, and where everyone's like acting in good faith and like really trying to approach the problem with like a degree of actual care for communities.
Yeah. I will say like when I think about like what I gained in my PhD, like it wasn't like, oh, I gained this like very specific knowledge in RNA biology or whatever. Like,
right.
Yeah, I did. But like, it just made me better at thinking. Like it made me better at thinking and questioning. Like, and that is what I feel like so much of science is. It's like really stopping to think and ask questions. And like in doing so, do things like improve vaccine technology, or like for us, like really stopping and thinking in terms of, you know, with Tiny Matters episodes, we're always drawing connections, not just, you know, to the past, but to the present, and thinking about like, what are the implications of this science? Like, what could be better? What could improve? Like, where can we debunk misinformation? Like, where, I don't know. That's part of science. Like, I feel like I'm continuing my time as a scientist, like, but just in a different mode, you know?
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of ways to learn that. Like, I don't want people to think like, oh, you got to do a PhD.
No,
like,
no,
I don't
no,
think this is what you're saying.
Trust me, I tell a lot of people who are like, I think I want to do a PhD. I'm like, let me ask you 15 questions. And if you don't answer yes to all of them, then I think you're good.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think what you're saying is like, it's about learning to not take things for granted. Like, it's really learning to be willing to be an idiot.
Yeah.
Like, if the thing that I remember learning the most from was like when people would ask questions that seemed dumb, and it was always from like the person who I thought was the smartest person in the room.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's how they became smarter, is they were willing to ask a question that sounds silly.
Yeah.
But that's the point. The point is to like ask things that might not feel comfortable, that might make you look dumb. And it's so hard to balance that with also wanting to maintain like things that are based in evidence, on fact, and to make decisions that are going to affect you, your family, your community. Like, I think what the polio story is for me, it's about the fact that there is never like just like a straightforward one answer, like the answer even in this amazing story of like how we've been able to kind of almost eradicate a virus that was, you know, making it hard for kids to just be kids. Like the thing that I learned from it is like the answers have always had to keep changing. Yeah. And you need people that you can trust, and you need a system that you can trust to make that possible.
Absolutely. Well said. And if you feel like you have a silly or like simple question for a scientist and they can't really answer it, or they don't seem willing to, that's on them. That has nothing to do with you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you everyone for listening to this longer episode than usual for sure. But like, it was so fun to really talk about these, like what got us into science, what the things that kind of hooked us, and share that with you all. So happy episode 100, Deboki.
Yeah, happy episode 100, Sam.
And thank you to all of our listeners. You're the best. We're excited to do another 100. Let's go.
And then I will feel very old.
Oh, yeah. The very, very 200. That's wild to think about. But like, just wait 4 years from now, we'll be like, whoa, 200.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this has been amazing. Great 4 years. So much to still look forward to. And so thank you for tuning in to episode 100 of Tiny Matters, a podcast brought to you by the American Chemical Society and produced by Multitude. Our audio engineer is Misha Stanton, and the Tiny Matters theme is by Michael Simonelli and the Charts and Leisure team. I'm so happy that we're still here, that we're still doing this. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of 2025, and we'll see you next time.